21. While his men stayed offshore, Rudolf rowed a fishing boat he'd borrowed into Ewig. Lord Louis had waxed lyrical about the mead in the Ewig Tavern, and it seemed like the most logical place to ask for information on Myroy Isle. No archers arrived to greet him. He changed from Viken furs to Isla wool, so no one gave him a second glance as he strode up the beach into the town. The tavern was right where Louis had said it would be, though nowhere near as full. Only something terrible could keep men from drinking. And Rudolf was here to learn what. He ordered a jug of mead and paid with coin he hadn't used since he'd left Isla. For a moment, he wished Louis was here to share the drink like he'd promised he one day would. One day would come when the war was over, Rudolf swore. Is it always so quiet here? Rudolf asked the tavern keeper. The man jerked his chin at the jug. Once you've tasted that, you'll be singing soon enough. Rudolf hastened to pour himself a drink and compliment the man on it, though Rudolf never tasted a drop. I mean, I heard word in port that something terrible had happened in the Southern Isles. Some said there was war. When there's war, things get burned and men die. Do you see any dying men here? The tavern keeper peered into Rudolf's face. I didn't catch your name. Rudolf, he offered, pouring a second cup of mead. Lately come from. Wolf, you're finally here. I thought you'd never come and I'd die waiting, an elderly voice cackled as a heavy hand with the weight of the world behind it thumped down on Rudolf's shoulder. Get my friend Wolf another jug, for he's promised me a battle. The smell of strong spirits engulfed Rudolf as the old-timer gave his cheek a sloppy kiss. The man kept up a monologue that sounded more nonsense than words, never letting go of Rudolf, until he had the second jug of mead in his hand. His grip turned to steel as his words became clear. Come Wolf, I have your oath. Surprisingly strong fingers dug into Rudolf's shoulder as he was all but dragged outside by the old-timer. This way, Wolf. Back to the beach, then along the shore until the fishing boats retreated behind a tumble of rocks. Still the old-timer led him on. Did you bring your chess set, Wolf? Blue eyes seemed to see into his soul. How did this old-timer know? I did, Rudolf admitted, extracting the board from the bag of belongings he'd brought along. A couple of spare tunics and his chess set. The old-timer's hands set up the pieces with an easy familiarity Rudolf recognized. Now shall we play, boy? The man demanded. Lord Louis, Rudolf began, not daring to believe he was right until the man confirmed it. Hush, Wolf. You're here to play, not tell tales about better men than you or me. The birds in the trees have ears, you know. He tried to tap his nose and missed. On purpose, Rudolf suspected. Rudolf lost 3 games in quick succession before Louis held his hand up. They're gone, I think, he said. And you have been wasting time in Viken instead of practicing strategy. I'm disappointed in you, Rudolf. I was busy fighting real battles for my king, instead of pretend ones where nobody dies, Lord Louis. Louis shrugged. Harold did fine without you for all these years. Why did he have such need of you now? Did you not tell him about the Albans? He made the first move. Rudolf shoved his own pawn forward. Harold has need of no one anymore. His son, my cousin, sits on the throne now to the annoyance of all his neighbors, who feel his lands and crown belong to them instead. He studied Louis's second move and captured his pawn, setting the piece upon the rock beside the chessboard. So you have been practicing after all. Louis regarded the board and made his move. Why are you here? To play games with you, it would seem, Rudolf said bitterly, watching Louis capture his first piece. Nay, the game is but the beginning. If you want to capture the queen, you must be ready not just to serve your king, but to become one. Louis moved his queen into the middle of the board, a move which to an inexperienced eye looked reckless, but Rudolf knew it was anything but. Does she still live, Louis? He moved his knight to where he might tempt the queen. Angus believes so, or he would be home by now. Much like my son, who is one of the young men assigned as Portia's personal guard. If she's still on Isla, as I believe her to be, you'll need an army to free her. Do you have an army yet, son? Rudolf's knight claimed another pawn. I have 3 ships full of men, but it is not enough, he admitted. I need more than men or ships. Ah, you're right. You need allies. Powerful ones. Louis gleefully captured the knight. Your king's in danger, son. A rabbit exploded out of the underbrush, flew along the beach, and scrambled under a rock, where it sat, quivering. Let's go for a walk, Wolf, Louis said loudly, seizing Rudolph's arm with one hand and the full mead jug with the other. My old legs get tired sitting for so long. Their listeners had returned, Rudolf guessed. He feigned drunkenness alongside the suddenly unsteady old man, as they made their way along the water's edge. Louis let out a few scraps of song, slurring the words, before changing to another tune that he murmured as well. Which is your boat? Louis whispered. Rudolf led the way, and Louis leaped aboard. He shoved the boat into the water and was well out of bowshot before anyone could reach them. I hope you weren't lying about that ship, son, Louis said. You'll have allies aplenty if you can free them of the Alban curse. The Albans have guessed right, and most of our lords are still honor-bound to defend them. So that's how they'd done it. Taking over the islands in a night would have required a lot of coordination. Perhaps Donald was not as stupid as they'd thought. Is there anyone I can ask? Rudolf said. Well, there's me, but all I can give you are men and supplies. If you want to win, what you need is a witch. I thought all the witches on the islands had died out, Rudolf said. From what he'd heard, it had been no loss. Some of them had enjoyed the evil they wrought. Louis laid a finger beside his nose. No missing it this time. That's just what they want you to think. The ships came into view, and Louis's smile widened. Oh, you've done well. This new king must like you. When I was a boy, I'd have said 3 Viking longships could conquer the world. When this is all over, I hope to be able to say it again. 22. The tiny rock island Rudolf rode up to looked like nobody lived on it, let alone some powerful witch. Are you sure this is the place? Rudolf grumbled, forcing his frustration into each stroke of his oars. Absolutely, Louis replied, settling contentedly in his seat. Of course he was content. He didn't have to row. How do you intend to find your witch? No need, son. She will find us. Unless I miss my guess, she already knows we are here. The real challenge will be persuading her not to set fire to our boots. Or the boat. Louis eyed the gunwales. I hope you can swim. Cursing Louis for a fool, nevertheless Rudolf brought the boat up to shore and beached it. He waited for Louis to climb out before dragging the coracle up beyond the high tide line. This time his wet boots might work to his benefit, if the witch was as volatile as Louis said. Louis led the way up the rocks and onto a rise. He cupped his hands to his mouth. Lady Rona, I have a proposition for you, he shouted, turning to repeat his offer to the other 3 corners of the island. I'm already betrothed, and not to that beast of a man. The sharp female voice came from behind them. Rudolf whirled. The diminutive girl stood on the sand with her hands on her hips. Louis gestured for Rudolf to say something. I am no beast, lady, Rudolf said gravely. I am Rudolf Vargson, Prince of Viken. I have come from my cousin, King Redar, to cast the Albans out of the southern isles. She sniffed. Just you and old Louis here? You have no chance, Prince of Viken. Not without an army that can match the Albans. I have 3 ships. Rudolf pointed. Is this the wolf we are waiting for? Rona demanded. Louis inclined his head. He is. She marched around Rudolf, looking him up and down. "What is your stake, Prince of Viken? What do you get out of saving the Southern Isles?" Rudolf had never feared anyone so much as he did this dark-eyed imp right now. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out of his inexplicably parched throat. "He wants Lady Portia," Louis supplied. Rona's eyes narrowed. "Lady Portia is no prize, like the women of other lands. She is the Lady of Isla, and if she does not like you, may heaven help you, for no one else will." Rudolf laughed. "Portia liked me well enough before I left. If she likes me still, well, I guess we shall see. As long as the lady is safe, I will be satisfied." "She is safe enough. My betrothed guards her with his life." "My son has sent word?" Louis asked eagerly. Rona eyed Rudolf, then answered, "When he can. His letters are carried in secret, and left in a place only he and I know. The lady lives, and so does he." "How goes the hiding, Lady Rona? Are your sisters sick of fish yet?" Rona turned her glare on Louis. "They complain constantly. The sooner this war ends, the better." "Would you like to help with the war, Lady Rona?" Rudolf ventured. She pursed her lips. "My father will not approve." Louis laughed. "Old fool. He thinks my son should save you, for what man would follow a hero who got himself saved by a maiden?" "Something of that sort." Louis jerked his head at Rudolf. "We can blame the victory on the Viken. I'm sure he won't mind." Rudolf stiffened. "I prefer to fight my own battles, but I am not such a fool as to refuse the help of an ally. There are shield maidens among my people, Lord Louis's late mother among them, who fight alongside their men. If you can assist my army—" "Ha!" Rona bit her lip, and the bush behind Louis burst into flame. He yelped and ran down to the water, but the fire followed him, blistering the very sands to glass until the sea steamed around him. "I told you. This witch can burn anything. With her on your side, you can't help but win." Rudolf fell to his knees. "Lady Rona, I beg you to help me free the Southern Isles from the invaders. I will give you anything you ask." She tilted her chin downward so that she might regard him. "I want all I've ever wanted. My husband. Free him from his oath to Portia, so that he can come home and marry me." With a wave of her hand, she extinguished the fire, and a breeze came out of nowhere to blow away the smoke as though it had never been. "What would you have me burn first?" The fire burned in her eyes now, and it was a terrifying thing. "Myroy Isle and every other island where Albans seek to hide," Louis said, splashing out of the sea. He shrugged off Rudolph's and Rona's stares. "What? I'm the Lord of Myroy. I can burn it if I want to." He fumbled around under his cloak, and pulled out the jug of mead Rudolf thought he'd left on the shore at Myroy. Louis uncorked the jug and lifted it in a toast, "To winning this damned war." He drank deeply. Rudolf held out his hand to Lady Rona. "Do we have an accord?" Her hand seemed so small in his, but the heat in her fingers reminded Rudolf that power came in many forms. "We do, Wolf Prince." 23. Rudolf rowed ashore under cover of darkness. Louis snorted awake mid-snore as Lady Rona leaped into the water to help Rudolf drag the boat beyond the waves. "My lady," Rudolf began. "Shut it, Wolf," she snapped. "Your lady's not here." "Louis." "We check the houses. See if there's anyone left. Then I alert the tavern." Louis smiled evilly. The only lights in Uig were in the tavern, but Rudolf checked anyway. House after house was empty, people and their possessions gone. He met up with Louis on the road to the beach. "No one left," Rudolf said. "I found a few hiding, but they only came for supplies. They'll return to the caves tonight." Louis squared his shoulders. Are your men ready, do you think? Rudolf smiled. Light the lamp, and you shall see. Louis unshuttered his lamp, and an answering light flared to life in the bay. The sounds of a Viking drinking song floated across the water. Hey, I know that one, Louis said. He seized Rudolf's hand and broke into a run. Vikings! In the bay! In ships, he shouted, repeating his frantic call to arms all the way up the road to the tavern. He staggered through the door, breathlessly announcing, Vikings in the harbor, before he collapsed spectacularly on the floor. Rudolf had to step over Louis to enter the tavern. I saw them too, he said. Invaders! He didn't need to pretend. Albans were enough to bring a genuine snarl to his face. The men he'd taken for islanders earlier in the day rose from their seats and headed outside with grim purpose. Vikings! To arms! The shout from outside issued from more than one mouth. The barman set out 2 cups and filled them, then pushed them toward Louis. Louis took one and gestured for Rudolf to take the other. Fill one for yourself, man, Louis commanded, and the barman obeyed. All 3 men lifted their cups before Louis continued, to victory. The barman drained his cup, then wiped his mouth on his sleeve. So it is time then? Time to fight. Louis slammed his empty cup on the counter. Come on, son. Drink up or you'll miss it. Rudolf did not need to be told twice. Down went the mead, and it was with the memory of sweetness on his tongue that he said, Leave town now if you want no part in the battle. The barman slapped a great sword on the bar, followed by a bow and a clacking quiver of arrows. I'm no coward. Lead the way, my lord. Rudolf returned to the now deserted street. The Alban drinkers had run off for reinforcements, and the unmistakable march of booted feet in the distance heralded their arrival. Rudolf cupped his hands round his mouth and let out his loudest war cry. A faint answer came from the boat in the bay. The rest of his men were in place then. The booted feet quickened their pace, and for the first time Rudolf saw them. As though every Alban he'd ever killed in his boyhood had come back to life, carrying torches as they raced to take their revenge. But not tonight. No, tonight they passed him by, headed for the beach. The Albans formed up along the shore, lifting bows and knocking arrows. Runners made haste along the lines, carrying buckets of oil and torches to set the fire arrows alight. In the bay, the Seawolf's sodden crew struck up a tune again, louder this time. They paddled parallel to the shore, still singing. Fire, someone shouted, and the arrows flew, arcing across the water to shoot the waves, sending up puffs of steam before they sank. Again. More arrows flew, but the boat was out of range. Frey rose from his seat and bellowed, The shore's that way, you fools. Turn this boat around. The singing men proceeded to row the boat in a circle, following the curve of the bay. Arrows rose and fell but didn't hit their mark. Cease fire. The Alban commander had seen sense. Wait until they are in range. But Frey was not as drunk as he seemed, and every man aboard the Seawolf knew to keep their distance, however loudly they sang. While Frey kept the Albans distracted, the rest of the Vikings crept out of the dunes. All of the raiders were veterans who'd fought the Oplanders under Rudolf's command. The enemy would not know they were there until they wanted them to. And then it would be too late. Rudolf silently signaled where he wanted his men. When they were in place, he let out another war cry. Vikings in the town, came the shout from the beach. Arrows rained down on the houses, setting fire to roofs and walls alike. Vikings poured from the houses and into the street, running from the town as though fleeing from the fire. The Albans gave chase, only to find the way blocked by a hay wagon that hadn't been there on their march in. Rona freed the horse from the wagon, gave it a slap on the rump to send it away, and stared at the wagon. The hay blazed into life. The Alban soldiers turned to go back the way they'd come. only to find the way blocked by another wagon, driven by Lewis. Rona cast some spell and set that alight too. Panicked soldiers turned to the houses, only to be met by a hail of arrows from both sides. Rudolf climbed atop the tavern's roof, the only one not burning, for fire arrows didn't work on sod, and set his own bow to work. Beside him, the tavern keeper proved to be a surprisingly good shot. In the flickering orange light, Rudolf glimpsed hell, dead and dying men crawling and crying for help that would not come. Albans all, as his men abandoned the burning houses, to climb on the roof beside him. Men still milled around on the beach, Albans who hadn't managed to get into the town before it went up in flames. Rudolf lifted his bow to finish the job. A hand shot out and grabbed his bow. "Nay, let them run," Lewis said softly. "Rona can speed them on their way. They have a tale to tell." Ribbons of flame snaked across the sand, biting at the boots of the Albans who remained on the beach. "Run, ye cowards," she screamed. "The Wolf Prince is coming for you and all your kind. The Wolf Prince will burn out every Alban until the southern isles are free of you." The men swarmed over the fishing boats, launching a frightened flotilla into the bay as the sea wolf beached itself on shore. "Shall we go after them, sir?" Frey shouted. Rudolf shook his head. He watched the boats drift away, reminding himself that each battle brought him closer to Portia. To home. "The war has begun," Rudolf said. Lewis slapped him on the back. "And we'll need more mead before it's done. Padrig, get our Viking brothers a drink." "Yes, my lord," Padrig the barman said. 24. Portia watched the Albans pack their things onto their horses and head for Portnahaven, casting frightened looks around them as they went. "Where are they going?" she asked. "Some say to fight the Normans back in Alba, while others say they're being sent to fight the wolf." Grieve shrugged and rubbed at a stubborn spot on his armor. "The lot of them pray that they might be sent home, for they've found a cold welcome here." "I hope they're being sent to the wolf and he kills the lot of them," Portia said. Tales of the Viking prince had reached her even here, for with Mason gone, her men shared meals and news with the Albans. News they were only too happy to bring back to her. "They are fighting men, no different from us truly," Dermot piped up. "And I wouldn't wish the wolf on any man. They say he moves like a ghost, taking a town before anyone knows he is there. And he burns places to the ground, with all the people inside too. 'Tis a terrible death, to be burned alive." Portia paled. "Towns? You mean the Viking prince can't tell the difference between our people and Albans?" "Perhaps. It's not like the wolf has lived among us, my lady," Grieve said. "Or mayhap he does not care. Our people gave the Albans shelter, invited them onto land the Viking king claims. While they dwell in our halls, we must defend them too. If he sees us as Alban allies against him, you cannot blame a man for calling us all his enemies." "I have not taken up arms against him." "Neither have you." Portia smoothed her skirt to hide her consternation. "Surely he will not consider us his enemies." "But we will take up arms against him, my lady. We are all honor-bound to defend you. We swore an oath." She remembered. How could she not? But the thought that these men, her only friends, would be forced to die for her, was one she was not willing to face. "Why do they call him the wolf?" she asked. "Surely the prince has a name." "He has many names, lady," said Damhan. "The wolf or the wolf prince. Lately, the one I hear most from the Albans is the big bad wolf." He laughed. "He sounds like a villain from a children's tale, but he frightens grown men as well as children." "Why?" Portia persisted. "He's a Viking giant, as big as they come," Brian said. "Any man who burns whole villages cannot be good. They say he torched the port at Myroy when he first landed, and every town he's touched since. And he is as crafty as a wolf. The Albans who fled Myroy said they would see one Viking and hurry to attack, only to find themselves surrounded and outnumbered. He has a mighty army, all giants like him, and he will not stop until the southern isles are his. A man so mighty even the Albans fled from him. And all Portia had to protect her were 10 good men. She shivered. What does he do to the women he captures? He's a Viking, so 'tis not hard to guess, Brian said. Rapes 'em, takes the pretty ones to his ship to be whores back in Viking, and kills the rest. Brian! Grieve roared. Have you forgotten who you're speaking to? Brian shrugged his meaty shoulders. Sorry if I offended Lady Portia, but you did ask. She had, though she wished she hadn't. Her people had allied with the Vikings to stop them from such things, but it was all for naught if this big bad wolf saw fit to ignore that and enslave them all instead. Set up my target for me. I wish to practice archery again, so that when I see this wolf I can shoot him, Portia said. Cal grinned and rose. I shall do it, my lady. If you shoot the wolf, I want to watch. 25. Isla rose from the ocean, naked in the sun. Waiting for him. Rudolph's heart swelled within his chest. No archers stood on the shore this time, and his 3 ships led a veritable flight of dragon boats from every inhabited island in the southern isles. They were filled with men from all the isles too, not just those from Viking. Isla was ever the heart of the isles, and they would not be free of the Albans until they had been driven from Isla's shores. Rudolf saluted the watchtower as they passed, wondering if they had sent a runner with word to wherever the remaining Alban army lurked. It mattered not. He and his men knew every landing spot on Isla, and they would not be driven off this time. They would land and they would fight until they won. Isla would be his. The sand crunched beneath his boots and Rudolf almost wept. Home. He was home. Movement in the watchtower above caught his eye, and he turned to squint at the cliffs. A flash of red or orange maybe on the heights? If he looked closely at the window just beneath the thick straw thatch, he could almost see it. He grabbed Frey, whose eyes were better than his. Look at the watchtower and tell me what you see, Rudolf commanded. Frey shaded his eyes. I see an archer. Maybe more than one. Would you like me to take some men to flush them out, sir? Portia. His mind flew to her, though he knew it could not be. Portia would not be atop some tower, waiting to shoot men coming ashore. She would be with her men, who would protect her. Unless this eyrie was the best place to keep her safe. 2 archers could hold the cliff path for a long time. Pick 2 and follow me, Rudolf said, setting off up that very path. He huffed and puffed a little, for it was steeper than he remembered. He knew when he was within bowshot, for he'd manned the tower himself for Lord Angus. Only then did he tug his helm down over his head and take his shield off his back. The familiar weight on his arm reminded him of the borderlands, the last place he'd needed it. He'd fought no open battles since he left Viking. On Isla, though, that would change. Everyone said this was where the Alban leader lived, and where else would his army have retreated to? Peering over his shield, Rudolf definitely saw something orange at the top of the tower. Orange and moving. He took a deep breath, followed by another, but there was smoke in the air. Not fire then. 3 strides up the path, he heard the whistle of an arrow. Up came his shield, but the missile fell short, slicing into the turf several yards ahead. He darted forward to retrieve it, then skipped back out of range before he dared to examine the arrow. An arrow from Isla, not Alba, he'd recognize the feathers in the fletching anywhere. More arrows flew, bouncing off rocks and the path ahead. You'll not have Isla while I live and breathe, Oathbreaker, a female voice shrieked as a fist shook out of a window high above. Rudolf laughed. What would you have us do, sir? Frey asked, bringing Alf and Eric up the path with him. Rudolf blew out an exasperated breath, and pointed at the tiny fist. Fetch her down, and anyone hiding up there with her. Tell her if she doesn't come, I will bring the whole tower down around her. Alf grinned. Gladly, sir. Rudolf held up his hands. Without hurting her. She's to be brought to me unharmed. His men dashed inside. He waited, knowing they'd reached the top when shrieked curses cascaded down. He wasn't sure who was the whoreson or the walrus's tail warmer, but he filed the insults away for a later date. They would keep. Slowly, the shrieking descended. The men let out cries of pain as the valiant lady fought back, and Rudolf almost regretted not allowing them to defend themselves. It was their own fault for not going into battle with full armor, he decided, feeling a smile lift his lips as the lady's boots came into view. Boots and the most enormous belly he'd ever seen. It took both Alf and Eric to hold her arms while Frey brought up the rear, keeping her upright so as not to damage the baby she carried. Rudolf couldn't seem to close his mouth. Portia, heavily pregnant? To who? If you've torn my dress, you whoresons, I'll see you sew it back together yourselves, she threatened. Her blazing eyes turned to Rudolf, who was glad his helm protected him from her wrath. And you? A misbegotten wolf who has broken every oath the Vikings have sworn to us. Conquering your allies, your friends. You are no friend of mine, you dog. She even tried to spit at him, but Angus's daughters were too well bred to manage such a feat. Not Portia. He should have known from her poor aim. Ali couldn't shoot a target a yard in front of her. Portia would have pinned the toes of his boots to the path before turning him into a pincushion. Rudolf swallowed back his disappointment. Ali would know where Portia was. Though not Portia herself, her sister was the next best thing. Take her to Rona, he said. Not all of his men could be trusted around a pretty woman, even a pregnant one, but they kept a goodly distance from Rona, and rightly so. She'd burned a few boots before they'd learned. Eric and Alf left with the girl, but Frey remained. Was there anyone else? Rudolf asked. Frey shook his head. Just her and this. He held up the bow and quiver. A half-full quiver and a man's bow. What Ali had been thinking, climbing to the top of the tower in such a state to shoot a bow she hadn't the strength to use, he did not know. But he could ask her that too. Once the men have landed, find somewhere to make camp. Send out scouts and have them report to me before sundown. Based on their information, we move out in the morning, Rudolf said. Yes, sir. He supervised camp construction, breaking up more than a dozen fights that erupted before the men were settled. They might all oppose the same enemy, but they were an independent lot, with grievances going back generations that none of them would forget. The men of Vatersay could not abide to be beside the men of Langroy, and the men of Ariska and Grimsey brawled if they so much as spoke to one another. Add those to the general complaints that one man had a better campsite than another, be it bog or rock or soft grass, and the men from Islay would defend their island with fists or weapons if need be. When evening fell, he was more exhausted than he'd believed possible. His shoulder ached from intercepting a punch meant for one of the Myroy men, delivered by an Eriskin with fists like hams. But as enticing scents started to waft from well-established cookfires, he knew his day was not over yet. He liberated a small pot of stew, 3 bowls and some bread, and headed for Rona's tent, where he would have to interrogate the prisoner. Rona met him outside, as if she knew he was coming. Magic most like, but it still unnerved him. He'd seen the things she could do, and he had to admit she terrified him just as much as she did his men, but he hoped he hid it better. I hope you know what you're doing, she greeted him. Rona jerked her head at the tent. My business is magic, not midwifery. If she births the babe in there, you'll be the one catching it, not me. Ali was in labor, and Rudolf would have to deliver the babe? He couldn't hide his horror. I'll send someone for a midwife directly, he said, turning to find anyone he could ask. Rona laughed. She doesn't need one yet. Some months to go, I understand. She eyed the food in his arms. Did you bring any wine? Ah, no matter. I heard the Eriskins brought plenty. I shall go and find some, for maybe that will loosen the lady's tongue. She had little to say to me that is not about the babe in her belly." She set off, and the men parted to allow her to pass. Whoever her betrothed was, he was a lucky man. She paid the other men no heed, unless they became impertinent. Then the smell of burning leather boots would waft across the camp, and a healer would be summoned to put salve on the burns. Rudolf cleared his throat as he poked his hand through the tent flaps. "Are you in a fit state for visitors, my lady?" Ali's voice was just as he'd remembered it. "If you're looking for the witch woman, she's gone for dinner. If you're her lover, I suggest you find somewhere else to spend the night. I will not share a tiny tent with some rutting fool she will forget as soon as her true husband returns." Rudolf stepped inside. "I'm not Lady Rona's lover, I promise you, Ali. I came to talk to you." Ali's eyes lit up. "Rudolf." She tried to rise, but instead she just seemed to rock back and forth. "Damn this belly, I feel like a whale. You must come here and give me a kiss." She held out her arms. Rudolf kissed her cheek and sat beside her. "I brought dinner. It's not roast pork from your father's kitchens, but it's the best we have." She took the offered food and ate with the appetite of a woman starving. Rudolf wordlessly handed her his portion as well, and began to worry there would be none left for Rona. "Maybe later," Ali said, setting Rudolf's bowl down. "I am so hungry all the time, and yet if I eat too much, this baby of mine is like to kick a hole right through me. Very defensive of his territory, he is." "Who is his father?" Rudolf asked. If some Alban had taken liberties with Lord Angus's daughter, he'd kill the man himself. "Rudolf the whale hunter," Ali said, her fond smile telling the tale of her love for her islander husband. "He spotted a likely bull in the water yesterday, and left with promises to bring me back a whalebone cradle. How could I refuse such a man?" "But why were you in the watchtower? And why was no one with you?" Rudolf pressed. Ali shrugged. "It is the best place to watch for whales and for whale hunters coming home. The girls from the village come to visit every day, bringing food and word of what is happening. None have visited today, but when I saw this army sailing in, I sat at the window with Whittald's old bow to defend my home, as any good islander wife would when raiders come. The things this wolf prince has done." She shook her head and muttered something about walruses under her breath. "What are you doing with this man and his rabble, Rudolf?" Rudolf didn't know what to say. Telling her he was the leader of what she called rabble didn't seem like the best idea. Evidently she hadn't recognized him as the man she'd shot at, now he'd taken his armor off. Finally he said, "They may seem disorganized, but they are united in a common purpose. Viking men and men of the Southern Isles fighting the Albans together, as our long-standing alliance says we will do." She pursed her lips. "Not just fighting the Albans. I've heard the stories even here. I bet Portia has too. Whole villages burned and everyone killed. How could you, Rudolf?" Tears sprang to her eyes. "Women. Children. How could you kill children?" "I've never killed a child." Rudolf protested, but he had hazy memories of Oplander boys wielding axes they could scarcely lift. Boys old enough to be at war, who were trying to kill him, however clumsily. He'd been the same age when he first went into battle, and he hadn't shied away from anyone who tried to kill him. As for women, like Vikings, Oplander women fought as fiercely as their men. He had several scars from wounds inflicted by women warriors. "This army has only fought Albans." "Well, mostly Albans," he amended, thinking of the brawl he'd broken up only an hour before when a Viking had mistaken a Myroy man's drinking cup for his own. "They are good men, Ali, I swear to you. They are here not to conquer Isla but to free it." "And this wolf prince? What sort of man is he?" she challenged. "Why do you follow him, Rudolf?" She truly did not know he and the wolf were one and the same, and Rudolf did not want to be the one to enlighten her. If he did, then he would have to tell her the truth. He hadn't come to free Isla, but to free Portia. What manner of man went to war over one woman? It sounded like madness, even to him. Madness that a whole army followed. "I do not know," he muttered, rising to his feet. Before she could say another word, he'd left the tent to walk the camp perimeter with only his own dark thoughts for company. 26. When day dawned, Rudolf was resolute. He'd managed a second interview with Ali, where she'd told him the last she'd heard, Portia was still in her father's house. No one had seen her for months, but her personal guard were there, and her men did not hide, so where they were, she would be too. It was strange to think of Portia as having multiple men, like she kept a harem of sorts. What did one call a stable of men? A barracks or a company perhaps, for they were a military unit, sworn to protect her and not her lovers. It took the men half the day to break camp, to Rudolf's bewilderment. If they did not move faster, it would take them 3 days to reach Angus's house, when it was less than a day's ride. But determination drove him, determination to free Portia and her lands from the enemy, and he needed the army at his back to ensure he did this time. Their slow progress gave him time to send out plenty of scouts, and mull thoughtfully on their reports. None of his men had seen a single Alban. In fact, they'd seen few men at all, though the villages on Isla were far from deserted. Women and children eyed the army warily as they passed, some unsheathing daggers they tried to hold in the folds of their skirts, ready to defend what was theirs. His men knew better than to attack a village without an express command from Rudolf. These were their own people, not their enemies. He made sure to pay for any livestock they took, and the sight of coins loosened tongues that hadn't been free to speak for some time. The Alban camp had been around Angus's house, though there were rumors of a second to the north, where Mason, the Alban commander, had a castle, or so it was said. Everyone seemed to know someone who had worked on the edifice, but none had seen it, or knew where it was. Somewhere hard to reach, they all agreed, before telling him it was on a cliff top, an island, or in the middle of a lake. Rudolf found himself imagining an underwater castle, where basking sharks sat on thrones while mermaids serenaded them. Or would it be the other way around? He'd heard tales of a mermaid who married a king, and she now presided over his court, her long gowns hiding her tail and scales from all those who might know her for what she was. "Sir, the men from Vatersay and Longroy are fighting again. It seems the only land left for them to pitch camp is a bog barely big enough for one of their groups, let alone both, and with no distance between them." Rudolf swore. They were like brawling children. A pity he could not spank them all. "Send for Lady Rona," he instructed. "Ask her to dry out the bog. Once she is done, I am sure there will be room for everyone. They will be bedfellows in the bog, or they may sail home." Irian grinned. "Yes, sir." He liked the young witch, Rudolf was certain of it. He didn't seem to fear her as much as the rest, though he kept a healthy distance from her too. If Rona's betrothed died before she could marry the man, Rudolf had no doubt Irian would offer himself in the man's stead. Rudolf crested the rise and his breath caught in his throat. He knew they'd set up camp on the same site the Albans had deserted, but the sight of Angus's longhouse sent a wave of longing through his body that he wished would carry him to the door and happier times. His scouts said the place was deserted, but Rudolf knew better. Even if Angus and the Albans had left, someone remained. The house and outbuildings had a watchfulness to them that Rudolf had learned not to ignore. He wore a breastplate but not his helm, and he carried his bow and his quiver on his back. His sword bumped against his side with each step, but he would not need his shield today. Not for this. The cook fire in the kitchen had burned down to coals, but there was no mistaking the fact that it had been used to prepare a meal today. A basket of apples lay on the table, their leaves not yet withered, as though they'd been picked only hours before. Someone was here. Someone who cooked and took care to harvest the orchard. A shrill scream that sounded like a distressed horse came from outside. Rudolf picked up an apple and went outside to investigate. The mare, a skittish beast that lifted her tail, threw back her ears and eyed him with menace before letting out a squeal, trotted away from him to rub herself against the fence. She stared him a while longer, as though daring him to try and ride her so that she might buck him off, before heading to the feeding trough to finish off her oats. The second scream didn't come from her, it came from the stables. Rudolf hurried to help. The stables were as empty as the kitchen, except for the screaming horse, doing his best to kick down the door of his stall. "Hector!" Rudolf lifted the bar to let the stallion out, then held out the apple. Would his horse still recognize him after all this time? Hector ignored the apple and stepped on Rudolf's foot as he shoved past him to leave the stable. Rudolf followed him, not willing to lose the beast. Hector took off at a gallop, soaring over the fence, before landing in the mare's field. He moved purposefully toward her feeding trough. Rudolf halted. The perverse beast had put himself where Rudolf would have taken him. Perhaps he knew better, and Rudolf should return to the buildings. Reuniting properly with his horse could wait. He returned to the yard between the longhouse, the kitchen, and the stables. Only now did he see the new building, its fresh-cut timber splintering his memories of this place. The barracks hall had not been here when he left, and its newness meant it could only have been built by Albans, for who else would construct a wooden barracks where a sod-roofed longhouse would do? The only islanders who preferred timber were the men of Mairoy, who didn't have enough sod for roofs, though they had plenty of trees. The barracks did not belong, and they would burn, he huffed to himself. Rudolf reached for his quiver. He stabbed his arrow point into a block of the soft white, waxy substance that made it burn whatever it touched. He marched into the kitchen and thrust the arrow into the ashes, but the stuff didn't catch. Swearing, he found some pine needles in the box of tinder and threw them among the coals. A wisp of smoke rose up. Throwing his arrow on the flagstones behind him, Rudolf dropped to his knees and blew the tiniest puff of air at the smoking needles. He held his breath for a moment, watching, praying, and then they caught, flames licking up them as if they wanted to swallow the needles whole. Again he stuck the arrow in the heart, and this time, the flames gratefully accepted his offering. Rudolf hurried outside with his blazing arrow, knowing he needed to fire the thing before the stuff melted and set fire to the kitchen. Outside, the sun blinded him for a moment. He turned, glared at the barracks, and let his arrow fly. No need to aim when his target was as big as a house. His arrow arced up and hit the roof, then disappeared, as if by magic. Rudolf's mouth dropped open. What in heaven's name had happened to his arrow? Smoke curled out of a hole he hadn't seen before. Several holes actually, arrow slits in the roof, he realized. "What do you think you're doing, you stupid beast?" a female voice yelled behind him. Rudolf whirled in time to see a red-headed woman sprint past him, carrying a broom. He followed her around the stable to the field where Hector had, "Get off her, you randy bastard," she shouted at Hector, who was too busy servicing the mare to care. "You're too late, he's probably already got her with foal by now," Rudolf called, more to protect his horse than anything else. He would not want to be interrupted while making love to a lady, though he'd have chosen a more private place than Hector had. "Did you let that menace out?" The woman rounded on him. "He would have kicked the door down if I did not," Rudolf said. She snorted. "You try telling Portia that. Mache is her mare." "Lena," he ventured. "Of course, you fool. Portia would have whacked you with the broom, not the bloody horse. First for being away so long, and then for letting the horse out. Then I think she might have burst into tears." Lena smiled. "What kept you, Rudolf? She's missed you so much." "I serve at my king's command," he said simply. What more could he say? "Where is she, Lena?" "If you were here sooner, I could say the loft." Lena pointed at the barracks building. Her eyes widened. "Why is there smoke?" She hurried toward it. Rudolf grabbed her to pull her back. Because it's on fire. Lena wrenched out of his grasp. Well, aren't you everybody's hero then? First you let the horse out, and then you set fire to the barracks. What else have you done? If you bring the army down on this house, I will hit you with this broom. Rudolf stared down at her eyes, as fierce as Portia's could be. He swallowed. What if I told you the army is here to free Isla from the Albans? So Keith was right. At Rudolf's blank look, Lena explained, my husband. He's father's steward, sending supplies to where he's fighting the Normans. He's seeing to a shipment of salt mutton, or he'd be here. Are you here to free Portia too? From husbands to mutton to Portia, Rudolf wasn't sure if he could keep up. Especially with the barracks definitely on fire now, flames licked at the roof through holes that didn't seem so tiny anymore. Where is Portia? Rudolf asked again. He's taken her. Who? Lena sighed. You've been away too long, Rudolf. Lord Mason, the Alban bastard who tricked father and the other lords into hosting Donald's armies. He's an arrogant prick who pisses off anyone who hears him, but he works well with stone. He built himself a castle in the north, the sort of thing even the Normans would envy, or so 'tis said. You'll need an army to get in, and maybe not even then. That's where he's taken her. Where? Lena shrugged. Some holy spot in the north, where the lords meet and drink so many barrels of ale they empty half our cellars. Council Island on Loch Findlagan? Rudolf asked, horrified. He didn't want to believe it. The Albans had built on the holiest site in the Southern Isles? That's the spot. The fire crackled loudly behind her, seizing Lena's attention for the first time. So you really are burning down Portia's barracks, are you? You're lucky she likes you. Her men built that, and kept her safe in the loft while the army was here. They won't take kindly to you when they see you've destroyed all their hard work. Are they with her? If he could not be with her, at least someone kept her safe until he could be. Of course. They are her sworn men. Lena stared. Who in heaven's name is that ruffian? A man staggered up the street dressed in stained rags. He looked like he'd been buried in a bog and clawed his way out again. You have to help me, he shouted. He fell to his knees at Lena's feet. Don't let the Vicans get me. Don't. He caught sight of Rudolf and crumpled into a sobbing heap on the ground. He pawed at Lena's boots. You must do as I say, you ugly whore. His words ended in a scream as his clothes started to smoke. Rudolf dragged Lena back from the flames a second time as the man turned into a human torch. Only one person could have done this. Rona, he shouted. Rona strode up the street, looking supremely unconcerned. He grabbed me, said some things that were not very complimentary, and tried to order me about. I set fire to his boots and he ran off, so I thought that was the end of it. So when he did the same to this lady here, I figured he hadn't learned his lesson. She leaned over and spat on his smoking skeleton. He was Alban anyway. No loss. Oh, and he dropped this. She held up a large gold medallion attached to a thick gold chain. Probably stolen. Albans robbed the dead on the battlefield. Keep it as a war trophy. Rudolf wanted to say something, anything, but he couldn't seem to find the words. He'd killed many a man, but Rona's cold-blooded slaughter seemed different somehow. Despite the blaze behind him, he shivered. Rona regarded the burning building. Ah, I'm not the only one who's been setting fires. Nice work, Rudolf. Perhaps you don't need me anymore. I do, he blurted out. The Albans have taken Portia to their castle in the north. On Loch Findlagan. The very heart of the Isles. I need all the help I can get to free her from them. Rona gave him a long look. I'll honor our agreement if you'll do the same. Rudolf bowed his head. You know you have my word. 27. Loud hammering startled Portia out of sleep. What is it? She mumbled sleepily. Stay aloft, my lady, came Greaves' quiet response from below. She heard the scrape and thunk of someone unbarring the door. What's amiss? Beric rumbled. 'Tis the wolf. He's landed on Isla and she must be moved. Fear trickled down Portia's spine. The Viking prince was here. The man who killed and burned everything in his way. Who would kill her men, burn this building like the wood pilot was, and when he got hold of her, Portia swallowed. Would he care about her claim, or see her as just another woman to rape? Seems to me there's more danger on the road than here, Greaves said. Perhaps, which is why we must move quickly and under the cover of darkness. If we reach the castle by dawn, no one will be able to reach her. She will be safe behind my walls, I swear. Mason. Their visitor was Mason, who sounded as frightened as Portia felt. Good. She hoped the wolf raped him first, or at least ran him through so she could watch. My sister will be here tomorrow. We must wait for her. I cannot leave her for the wolf, Portia called down. Greaves tried to hush her, but Portia would not be silenced tonight. She shoved the ladder through the trapdoor and began to climb down. You hush yourself, Lewison. If I do not agree to go, then I will tie you to my saddle and carry you myself, Greaves finished for her. I'm sorry, my lady, but your safety is more important than your wishes. Or your sister. We shall leave your things in the longhouse with a note for her to send them on. Pack only what you can carry, for if the wolf is on Isla, then he is within a day's ride of here. We cannot defend you here with so few, but what I've heard of Mason's castle is such that it might be defended by 10 men, for it is a formidable place. Dermot will wake the kitchen maids and the cook. They will come too, for there will be no other women to keep you company otherwise. Portia wanted to argue, but she knew he was right. So she glared at Greaves instead. You've been complaining for months about being a prisoner here, and how you never get to go riding. Don't you want to ride Mache? Greaves coaxed. She's in heat. She'd bite anyone who tries to saddle her. I must leave a note for my sister, telling her not to let Mache get near any of the other horses until she settles. If she hurts Hector, Rudolf will never forgive me. Greaves' shoulders relaxed. Thank you, my lady. It would try me sorely to have to tie you to the saddle like a prisoner. She smiled grimly. Saw is right. I'd bite or stab anything I could reach. I'll not be thrown over any man's saddle without a fight. I know. Have the men prepare the horses. All but Hector and Mache. They must stay. For a moment, she hesitated. What if the wolf hurt Hector? If he did, she would tell Rudolf what his countrymen had done. You pack your things. I will take care of all else, Greaves said. Back up the ladder, Portia went. She bundled up some spare clothes and pulled on some boots. Everything else she owned went into the chest of her mother's, that her men had brought from the longhouse for her. She lifted her bow and quiver. What will happen to the things I leave? She called down. A groom will take the wagon and follow behind us. Whatever you want him to bring should arrive late on the morrow, Greaves said. She shouldn't need to shoot anyone between now and then. She'd be inside the castle before it was light enough to see her target, surely. She dropped the bow and quiver in the chest and slammed the lid shut. I'm coming down. 'Twill just take a moment to pen a note for my sister, and I will be ready. She dropped her cloak and bundle on the barracks floor and launched herself after them. My lady. Greaves lunged forward to catch her. Portia landed neatly on her feet without falling over. She grinned, proud of herself. I'm not a flagon of mead. I don't break that easily. Do you think I'll be able to run in this castle you're taking me to, or is there a special dungeon prepared for me that's smaller than this one? She'd never seen a castle but envisioned it as a sort of stone version of her father's longhouse. Or his hall maybe. She could run the length of the hall at least. Heber laughed. Lady Portia, this is a castle. It's huge. There's a practice yard inside the walls, or so my cousin says. His cousin had helped build it, so Heber should know. So there'll be space where I can practice shooting outside? She asked hopefully. You shall see when you get there, my lady. Are you finished with your letter yet? Grieve said. Portia laid down her quill. She sent up a silent prayer for Lena's safety and rose. Let us go. She fastened her cloak and took up her bundle as though this were an ordinary day or night, but she couldn't stop the thrill she felt inside. She should be more frightened, but she was giddy at the thought of freedom. In the harsh light of day, she could worry about the wolf again and what he would do to her and Euler. Tonight, she intended to relish her first ride in longer than she liked to remember. Her horse, a beast she did not know, sensed her excitement and pranced about like the animal had been locked up for too long too. My lady, we must make haste, Grieve said. She grinned. Haste, you say? She squeezed the mare between her thighs and whispered a command, letting the horse have her head. The mare flew. Startled shouts came from behind her as her men urged their horses to match her speed. Portia laughed merrily. I have not forgotten how to ride, boys. Have you? Let's see who reaches the castle first. Loch Findlagan was too far for a true race, but she held her own until she felt her horse growing tired and allowed her to slow. Her men caught up, muttering curses they normally would not voice. At least not around her. My lady, Grieve began. Portia turned innocent eyes on Grieve. You did say we needed haste. That I did, but that's not something I need to remind you anymore, I think. I wanted to show you that. Grieve seized her bridle and pointed. From this height she could see clear to Portnahaven, and what lay between. A sea of campfires, showing the sheer size of the wolf's army. Thousands of men, surely. More than she'd ever seen, anywhere. Who could stand against an army like that? We do not stand a chance, do we? They will take what they want, and no one will stop them. Tears formed and fell. Tears for Isla, the precious island they would conquer. They were already lost. Of course we do. We are the Southern Islanders, my lady. They may burn our homes, our harvest, our whole damn island, but our people will survive and rebuild. You will survive to lead them. I swear it. The same darkness that hid her tears concealed Grieve's expression, but Portia didn't need to see it to know. I don't want you to die for me, Grieve. Not you, not any of you. His teeth glinted in the moonlight as he grinned. Then you'd best pray the wolf is a reasonable man who is willing to negotiate. After a week against Mason's walls, maybe he will be. He moved ahead to order their party into what he called a more defensible formation, before returning to her side. The joy of the nighttime ride began to pall sooner than Portia expected, but she did not complain. Anything to be out of her loft prison. The sky was lightening as they approached the loch. Portia had not been here since she was a child, and she'd read and reread her mother's scroll on the history of this place so many times in captivity that she knew every word by heart. Here was the seat of the original lords of this land. Her ancestors through her mother's line. Her mother's people had carved those standing stones, weeping sweat and tears as they dragged them into place to honor deities long dead. Or perhaps not, for there was a holiness to this place that hung over it like fog. Maybe the old gods had made their last stand here, and were buried in the mounds that ring the loch round. Here she and her men would make their last stand too, before she was forced to surrender Isla and likely her maidenhead. But not yet. The wolf would have to breach other walls first, and mighty walls they were too. Her breath caught in her throat as she took in the enormity of what Mason had built. The castle covered Council Island, so the waters of the loch lapped at the walls. Not all the way around, but then it had not rained for days. The water level would soon rise and hide the island again. She began to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was some hope left. 2 boats waited to take them to their island home, and Portia surrendered her horse to a man she didn't know, who swore he'd take care of the mare before sending her home. She glanced at Grieve, who was doing the same with his horse. Time to trust his judgment, she decided, for she was too tired to think anymore. Her boat drifted under a stone arch topped by a spiky metal gate. It was open to allow her entrance now, but the heavy chains holding it in place spoke of how quickly it could be lowered to keep the world out. Dermot helped her out, and Portia found she needed his assistance, for her legs ached after the unaccustomed ride. "Guard her," Grieve said, directing the rest of his men to search the place. Dermot and Cowell stood by her side, staring up at the high walls as avidly as Portia did. "It's huge," Cowell breathed. "You'd need a dragon to get into this place." Dermot laughed. "Didn't you hear? That dragon in Casmiris is dead. Some knight slew it and won himself a bride. As long as the wolf doesn't have it. No one's sure how he manages to burn whole villages when it's pouring with rain. A dragon might do that. Someone would notice a honking great dragon in the Isles by now." Dermot scoffed. "If the Albans didn't see such a beast, then he doesn't have one. Maybe this wolf is beast enough on his own." Dermot and Cowell debated about how to beat wolves and dragons while Portia fought to stay awake. "It's empty." Portia blinked, her eyes open. Damn, she'd fallen asleep on her feet. "It's empty," Grieve repeated. "No one here but us. Now the servants are here, I shall shut the gate and you'll be safe, Lady Portia." "Can I sleep?" she mumbled. He laughed. "Yes, my lady. The men are preparing a pallet for you in the tower room. Tonight I'll have a bed brought up, but now you may rest." "Where's the tower?" she slurred, looking around. "With your permission, my lady." Portia had her legs swept out from under her as Grieve lifted her in his arms. If she'd had the strength, she'd have shouted at him to put her down. But she did not, so she settled back and told herself she'd tell him off in the morning. Behind her the gates clanged shut and darkness descended. "You must let me in. You must." Shouted words woke her, and Portia struggled to rise. How long had she slept? It looked near noon, but it was hard to tell with so many clouds in the sky. Loud clanging as someone rang the gates like they were a bell. "Let me in, damn you." Portia stuck her head out of the tower window. Mason sat in a boat outside the gates, whacking at them with his oar. He shook his fist at her. "Let me in, or I shall take a stick to you, like your father should have, you ugly whore." "Insulting my lady will not let you in, you great blubbery fool," Grieve shouted back from the walls above the gate. "In fact, I am honor bound to keep you out, for you threatened her, and I must keep her safe. Go back to your homeland, for you're not welcome here or anywhere else on the Southern Isles." "But there's an army on the way. An army of Vikings. The only safe place is inside those walls," Mason insisted. "Then I thank you for building them, as they will protect my lady. 'Tis a fitting parting gift you give her, after trespassing on her hospitality so long. Get you gone before they get here, man. For if they catch you outside the gates, they will squash you like the cockroach you are." "What about your laws of hospitality?" Mason demanded. "'Tis not my roof you lived under, nor my lady's. You may ask her father for shelter if you wish, but I've seen you shit upon guest right for too long to be stupid enough to offer it to the likes of you. Perhaps you should not have sent Lord Angus to fight so far away. Maybe if you hurry, you may reach his house before the wolf's army do. Maybe he'll give you shelter if you offer to build him a castle such as this." I hope he gives that ugly whore you serve to his men, so that they may rape the bitch to death. She deserves no better, Mason shouted as he rowed back to shore. Portia wanted to shout back in kind, but the barb in his words had hit home. Perhaps the man was right, and that would be her fate. She would rather take a dagger to her own breast first. She slid down the wall to sit on the cold flagstone floor. Would she end her days in this prison? My lady, I will not let that happen. Grieve stepped into the tower room and closed the door behind him. He moved to the window and pulled the shutters closed too, filling the room with shadows. There is a reason why I chose this room for you instead of the Lord's chamber, though the other is warmer. We have taken the room below you as our barracks, so anyone attacking the castle must fight their way through us before they can reach you. And if they do, then you must escape. He slid his fingers down the window frame and pulled a section away from the wall. A dark void beckoned, a space within the walls Portia would never have guessed existed. You must climb down, then follow the passage to the hidden door. There is a boat down there, so that you may row ashore. If the castle walls are breached, we will give you the time you need to get away. His eyes met hers, saying the words that he did not. I won't let you die for me, Grieve. None of you, Portia said. He smiled faintly. Lady Portia, you are the second most powerful lady I know, and not even you have the power to prevent that. I stand by my oath. And what of Lady Rona? Portia demanded. If nothing else, Rona will avenge me. She has a temper that matches yours, my lady. He bowed. Now get some sleep while it is still quiet. Or you'll wish you had, for there will be an end to peace once that army arrives. She had to laugh at that. It was either that or cry. Crying could wait until she had to make use of that secret passage, she promised herself. For if she descended into the darkness, all would be lost. 28. That blocky stone structure rising out of Loch Findlagan where Council Island should be was an abomination. The gods of the old faith would have struck it down with lightning, thunder, and whatever else they had in their arsenal. He wished the new ones would do it instead, but he didn't think saints dealt in lightning. Pity. He'd happily hail it as a miracle if they did. At least his army were getting better at setting up camp, though he had to admit the failing light hurried them along better than he could. No one wanted to be caught out in the rain without their tent up. Not when they'd marched in it all day. Perhaps they were too tired to start any fights tonight, was all. Or awed by the place where they stood, for Loch Findlagan was the home of Council Island, a holy place where no islander was allowed make war on another. And he'd brought war to it. Lord Angus would never forgive him for this. 'Twas a good thing he wasn't here to see it. Rudolf would not have done this if it was an islander who held Portia prisoner. No, he'd have called the man out and the battle would have been between just the two of them, as was proper. But the Albans had brought in their army and fortified Council Island itself. He had no choice. Better that it was a Viking leading this army and not an islander then, even if islanders outnumbered the Vikings in his army. He'd been considering possible attack strategies since the castle came into view, and he still had nothing. How did one attack a rock? Not even Rona could burn stone. In all his years of fighting, ambushing and being ambushed in Viken and on the Southern Isles, he'd never come up against something like this. You couldn't climb those smooth walls the way you scaled a cliff. And the damn thing was in the middle of a lake, with no sign of the boat fleet that had carried him to the island last time. A tiny coracle was the only craft he could see, a one-man craft that might take 2 or even 3 if they were slight and didn't mind the closeness. Children maybe, or 2 women. He would not need to attack if he offered them something they wanted. More than anything, he wanted an end to this war. If Portia was safe, he would be willing to trade almost anything. Portia was the politician, as astute as her father or Lord Lewis. Rudolf was a warrior and a strategist. She would know what to offer when all he wanted was her. A trade perhaps. If he offered the Albans her sisters as hostages, perhaps they'd be willing to negotiate. Maybe even open the gates. Lena settled Ali in the boat, shoving a cushion between her sister's back and the gunwale. If anything happens to her or the babe because of you, Wolf, I and my kin will hunt you to the ends of the earth to exact our vengeance. Rudolf nodded. Coward that he was, he couldn't look her in the eye, so he'd worn his helm for this. Full battle dress in fact, as he paced along the shore, letting those in the castle get a good look at him. A young Eriscan lad had volunteered to row the ladies across the lake. He looked no bigger than Rudolf himself had been the day he arrived at the Southern Isles, but he had the same courage. And so Rudolf had agreed, letting the most vulnerable members of his army assault the castle. For they had a better chance of gaining entry than he. His men lined the shore and theirs lined the battlements, watching the coracle's progress as it rippled between them. Could two armies hold their breath? For it seemed the only sound he could hear was the plash of oars as the two flame-haired girls retreated from him. A third flash of orange at the tower's top window stopped his heart. Portia! He wanted to fly across the water and take her in his arms, but she was as far out of reach as heaven itself right now. Even her face was out of view, hidden by her hair as she faced the oncoming boat, not him. She'd seen her sisters all right. She turned her head further still, meeting the eyes of, was it one of the men on the battlements? She gestured imperiously, her meaning clear. She wanted them to let her sisters in. One of the armored men on the battlements let out a shout, waving his arms with as much energy as Portia. Was he commanding his men to open the gates, or fire on the defenseless boat? Surely no man of honor would open fire. They couldn't. The gate at the waterline began to rise. Lena shouted and pointed, and the Eriscan boy headed for the opening gate. The boat slid into the darkness before the gate clanged shut once more. His army began to disperse, heading for their tents or whatever they wanted to do while they waited. Polish their armor perhaps. But Rudolf was rooted to the shore, his eyes fixed on the tower window that no longer held the flaming beauty who'd haunted his dreams for so long. Gods help him from the old faith and the new. He'd sacrificed a boy, 2 women and an unborn babe just for the hope of seeing her again. He hoped Portia would forgive him if he failed. 29. Despite all her talk of wanting to run and shoot and do all the things she hadn't done in the barracks hall, Portia found herself peering out the window just like she had when she lived in the loft. She could sit in the tower windows if she'd wanted to, but the stone was too cold, so she hung back, not wanting to touch it. There was plenty to see. The army came in an orderly column, creeping into the valley like ants until they grew into men and settled on the shore where her own men had left their horses. The beasts were gone now, back to her father's stables with a groom, for there were no stables here to house them. Most of the army marched on foot, with a few hooded or armored figures on horseback. The Wolf Prince could be no one other than the proud peacock who led them, probably insisting no one else could ride before him, lest they kick up dust or mud that might foul the highly polished sheen of his armor. His poor horse had to bear the weight of not just him but all his weapons too, for the man had sword, shield, axe, bow. He carried an armory on his back, as though he expected an attack at any time. And so he should. A Viking who attacked the Southern Isles was an oath-breaker of the worst kind, breaking an alliance that had stood for centuries. She wanted to take up her bow and shoot him then and there, but she knew he was out of range. Even from this height, she was too far from shore to shoot anything not on the lake's surface. If he could be persuaded to board a boat though. The tiny coracle Mason had left in the mud wouldn't stand up to more than a few well-placed arrows, before the holes in the hide let in enough water to sink it. Wearing so much armor, the wolf was sure to sink, and good riddance. His army set up camp with alarming efficiency, which surprised her when she realized only the first few ranks of troops were Viking. The lines marching over the hill now were unmistakably islanders, so many men. She hadn't known there were that many men on all the southern isles, yet here they were. Why? Why would her own people follow a man who burned their homes and killed their families? No man of the Isles would throw away his own honor in such a way. He'd kill the wolf with his own hands for sure. For the first time she began to doubt the tales she'd heard. That the Albans feared him she'd known. But her own people, they weren't stupid. They wouldn't stand by and watch their own people die. Did they believe the wolf was their ally? Big and vulpine perhaps, but not so bad? The vast army made themselves at home on the valley floor while the wolf paced the camp. He was a big man, bigger than most, and he'd pitched his own tent in the center of the camp, bigger than the rest of course. The cloaked riders favored the second largest tent, on the far edge of camp, away from the water. 3 of them. One waddled like he was as fat as Mason, but there was something about the way the figure walked that made her certain it wasn't him. Besides, an Alban among this army would be in chains or tied to a stake. Not free to walk about the camp. Have you never seen an army before? Portia looked up to meet Greaves' raised eyebrows. Not like this one. Me neither. Now I know what Lord Angus faces in Alba. 'Tis a fearsome sight. He held out the covered bowl he'd carried up the stairs. I brought your dinner. Seeing as you didn't come to the dining hall with the rest of us. She took the bowl. Thank you. I suppose I have spent so long alone I am not accustomed to freedom? Greaves supplied. This is all new to me too, my lady. There is what I know and then there is this. He waved at the view. What are they doing? Portia leaned out of the window to get a better look. They're sending someone out in the boat. 2 of the cloaked figures. Witches? Priests? She couldn't be sure. They were accompanied by an islander boy, who rowed the boat like he'd been born to it. A fisherman's son probably. But the cloaked riders. The wolf stood on shore, speaking to the riders. Together they reached up and lowered their hoods. Portia let out a shriek. It's Lena and Arlie. My sisters. And Arlie's pregnant. She pointed at the girl's belly. I'm going to be an aunt. Greaves swore and bolted down the stairs. If you don't let them in, I'll open the gates myself, she called after him. Soon after, he appeared on the battlements, gesticulating wildly as he argued with Brian. More than once, he stabbed a finger in her direction. Finally, Brian headed down to the gates. Portia watched the boat sail beneath the castle before it was her turn to race down the stairs. She was breathless by the time she reached the bottom, but she didn't slow. It had been too long since she'd seen her sisters. They clambered up the steps, looking just as tired as she'd been when she first arrived. Of course they'd been riding all day. Portia issued orders for a feast to be prepared, and for water to be brought up to her room so that they might wash, for where else would they sleep? The enormous bed was more than big enough for 3 of them. She wasn't sure who to hug first. Arlie, lest her baby decide to arrive this very moment, or Lena, who she'd only just missed. Greaves stood beside them with a grave look on his face. Tell them what you told me. Arlie's face crumpled as she burst into tears, leaving Lena to say the words, We are here as the wolf's envoys. He offers everyone in the castle safe passage off Isla, if they open the gates and lay down their weapons. Portia's mouth was dry. It was too easy. It must be a trick of some kind. Or, what does the wolf ask in return? That King Donald gives up all claim to the Southern Isles and its people. Portia had expected that, and she would happily support it. And that you surrender Portia to the wolf. Even Lena leaked a few tears as she said it, though she quickly wiped them away. I'm sorry, Portia. That's what he wants. What does he want of me? She asked. It doesn't matter. He shall not have her, Grieve said. The men on the walls rumbled their agreement. How long do I have? Portia whispered. It does not matter. He will have to tear down the walls and kill every man among us before he can touch you. He wants your answer by noon tomorrow, Lena said. Portia nodded. She blinked back tears. Tomorrow it would be time to end this. Then tonight we shall have a feast to remind us of happier times, and tomorrow he will have his answer, Portia said. His answer lies at the point of my sword. Portia linked arms with Ali and Lena. Come, I'll take you to my chamber where we may wash while the men make plans for the morrow. It took some time to help Ali up the stairs, and even longer to catch her breath. Being cooped up in that loft had not done her any good. She hoped the wolf would let her see the sun a little, at least. What there was of it. While Ali collapsed on the bed, complaining about how her back hurt, Lena pulled Portia aside. There's something else. I didn't want to say it in front of all those angry men out there, for they are beyond reason right now. What is it? It's Rudolf. Portia's mouth was dry once more, and she feared it might be a desert until the day she died now. What news of Rudolf? Lena wet her lips. He's down there. He rides with them, Portia. This is the help he brought, at our father's command. Most of the men are our people, fighting to be free of the Albans. They fight with the wolf, not against him. And Rudolf? He has the wolf's favor, I am certain of it. Because he was the one who took us prisoner, and it was nothing like I had heard. He has treated us as well as any of the men in that vast horde. Food, a place to sleep, a tent to keep the rain off, horses to ride while the men march. None of the Vicans has laid a finger on us, and no man among them has even hinted at it. They fear the wolf's wrath. Lena gripped her shoulder. Portia, make your men see sense. When they surrender, you'll get to see Rudolf again. Isn't that worth it? She wanted to say that it was. A week ago, she might have given anything to see Rudolf again. But to see the man she'd loved for as long as she could remember, as she surrendered herself to another man? A man who owned his allegiance as he would own her too. Darkness lay on her heart, as never before. This morning she thought she could bear whatever the wolf would do to her. But if Rudolf had to watch, it would break her heart. She forced a smile for her sisters. No more talk of war or the morrow. Tonight we feast and talk of the past. For I have missed much, it seems. I know Ali was always a greedy guts, but when did she learn to eat melons whole? The talk turned to lighter things, but the darkness within remained. Later, she would surrender to it. Now, she had her last supper to enjoy. 30. Portia waited until her sisters had fallen asleep, before she crept over to the window. Despite their protestations about receiving kind treatment from the wolf, their journey from their burnt homes to here could not have been an easy one. They would sleep for some hours yet, so soundly perhaps, that they wouldn't notice her absence at all. Night air puffed through the window, chilling her bare arms. It was colder out here on the loch, and the stone walls seemed to drink the chill, making the castle colder still. Portia dressed quickly, trusting her long skirt and cloak to protect her from the biting breeze. Stockings and shoes would only slow her down tonight. Her bow and quiver might come in useful, though. She slipped her finger into the quiver, questing until she found what she sought. She stashed the pouch in the pocket of her cloak before slinging the bow and quiver over her shoulder, leaving her hands free. Placing both hands on the wintry stone, she climbed onto the windowsill. It was wide enough for her and her sisters to have used it for a bed, or for her to stand there while she opened the hinged section of the timber window frame to reveal the secret passage. A whiff of the fish oil that she'd used to silence the hinges reached her nostrils, but it was better than a loud squeak rousing sound sleepers. She would endure far more discomfort before this evening was through. A ladder led down into the darkness between the castle's inner and outer walls. A passage to freedom, or in this case, answers. Portia twisted, trying to step from the sill to the ladder, but something caught on the window frame, holding her back. Cursing quietly, she backed up. It was the bloody bow of all things. Which wouldn't be much use if she ran into trouble. She was better at shooting enemies from a distance. Stabbing someone with an arrow was silly, especially when she already had a dagger. Portia considered for another moment, then unhooked the offending thing from her shoulder and dropped it on the floor. The quiver clattered down atop it, and Portia winced, wishing she hadn't been so loud. Her gaze darted to the bed, where her sisters slept on. She allowed herself to breathe again. The ladder rungs were rough under her feet, making her wish she'd brought her boots, but she refused to return for them now. Instead, she pulled the window panel closed to hide her descent. Darkness cloaked her, settling like a layer of wet wool. Or was that her dread at what waited for her? Not in the darkness, but across the lock. If dread weighed her down, at least it gave her the push she needed to keep climbing down until her feet sank into sucking mud. Trying not to think of corpses sucking at her toes each time she took a step, corpses of the men who would die tomorrow if she failed, Portia made her way along the secret passage to its hidden entrance, or exit in her case. She stumbled over the boat Grieve had told her would be there, but she didn't take it. Not yet. She'd memorized her mother's scroll, and if it was correct, there was another, more ancient way across the loch that didn't require rowing. She continued down the passage until she found what she sought. A timber half-door, covered in a thin layer of stone to conceal its true nature from the outside world, yielded to her touch. Its hinges were not so silent, but there was no one about to hear their squeaky protest. Moonlight turned the lock into a mirror, for there was no breeze down here. No need, for the air was positively frigid. Portia scanned the shore, looking for the standing stones she knew had to be there. Stones that had seen the passage of so many people, yet they would still stand after this battle, sentinels of time. One dot, and then she found the second, a finger pointing at the sky as if to remind her that she could only hide in darkness, so she only had until dawn to find her answers. She edged around the castle walls, knowing she had to line the stones up properly to be certain she stood in the right place. Her ancestors had done this from time immemorial, or so her mother's history scroll had said. There was no need to be frightened of following in their footsteps. But her ancestors had not faced a legend, a man who'd had so many stories spun about him that he seemed the very devil himself. And yet, her sister's safety spoke of someone who understood chivalry and honor, who might save what others sought to destroy. She wasn't sure what to believe anymore. She dreaded, and yet she hoped. Which was why she would face him alone. Portia paused to squint at the stones again. Now she could only see one, perfectly aligned. She took a deep breath and stepped into the loch. Icy water swirled around her feet, and her breath huffed out in a startled cloud of condensation. Her boots would not save her from the loch, but she wished she'd worn them anyway, if only for an extra moment's warmth before they grew sodden and slowed her down. She held her hem high to keep it from getting wet, until she realized that the water didn't even reach her ankles. She let the fabric fall, lifting her gaze to the stones to keep her on her course. The ancient causeway lay hidden beneath the surface of the loch, and one wrong step would result in a ducking. Her nearly numb feet already found it hard to feel the stones, so she must maintain her vigilance. The shore came closer and closer, and Portia dared to hope she might reach it before the numbness spread to her knees. She was only a few yards away when a male voice demanded, "Halt!" She blew out a breath she hadn't known she'd been holding. Hope sank to the bottom of the loch, threatening to drown her courage with it. 31. "I told you ghosts don't take orders," one voice insisted. They might. She might have been a really obedient wife in life. "How many spirits have you seen?" a second voice reasoned. "It doesn't matter. She's walking on water. That makes her a ghost or a witch. It's angels that walk on water, you fool. The devil's servants sink. I heard a sailor at Beacon Isle tell the story of a woman who walked on water. She was a witch. She could see into men's souls to decide whether to sink your ship or save you, they said. There are good men and bad in every bunch, or on every ship. How'd she know which ships to sink if there were both kinds of men aboard? I don't know. Do I look like a witch? You look like the idiot who just ordered a ghost to halt. Well, she did, didn't she? She even gave you a gift. Rudolf listened to the exchange with amusement, but his curiosity got the better of him. This was his army camp, and no one got in or out without his knowledge. Not even a ghost. The gift's not for me. It's for the commander, she said. If she is a witch, maybe she's trying to curse him. Rudolf poked his head out of his tent. What is this cursed gift? The two men stopped, looking sideways at each other until one of them said, It's like this, sir. There's a lady out on the lake who walks on water, who asked me to give you this. He set the small pouch on Rudolf's outstretched palm. He weighed it for a moment, wondering if it was empty. I have heard of a woman who can walk on water. A witch so powerful that water obeys her. She used to live at Beacon Isle, but now she wears a crown. Queen Margarita her name is, and her kingdom is not too far north of here, Rudolf said. Begging your pardon, sir, but what would a queen be doing out on yon lake so late at night? The gift-bearer asked. Rudolf emptied the pouch into his hand. Handing out gifts, or so it would seem. Both men recoiled and crossed themselves. Dead virgin's fingers. That must be a powerful curse, sir. Throw them away before the magic takes hold. Rudolf prodded one of the pale fingers. It was hollow, as were its companions. When he turned them over, he found the lacings holding them together. The finger guards were so well worn they still held the shape of their mistress's fingers. Portia would not abandon these on the eve of battle. Unless she intended to stop the battle from taking place. Rudolf tucked the finger guards safely back in their pouch. Take me to this woman. I must see her for myself. The two men hesitated before the one who hadn't spoken yet ventured, Sir, is that you issuing orders, or are you under the influence of the witch's curse? Make me ask again and you'll be on latrine duty until next year. Both of you, Rudolf stressed. Yes, sir. They trotted off, hunting hounds eagerly leading the way to his quarry. Or so Rudolf hoped. If the lady had gone. Yet as he reached the lake's edge, his breath caught in his throat. There was someone standing in the water, though she appeared to be floating on its surface. Now he understood why his men had mistaken her for a ghost. Rudolf extended his hand. Why don't you come ashore, my lady? He asked. She turned so that the hood's shadow hiding her face pointed toward him. Would you step ashore, knowing the land is occupied by an enemy's army? Rudolf pulled the finger guards from their pouch. The lady who owns these will never be my enemy. I promised to protect her, and my promise still stands. She lifted her hands to her hood, ready to lower it. What can you tell me of the man they call the Wolf Prince? A highborn Viking, cousin to the king, commander of this army and conqueror of the Southern Isles. It sounded quite impressive, laid out like that. Maybe it would impress her enough to make her forget how long he'd been away. Not this isle. Not yet, she said fiercely. No, it was not enough to impress Portia. Rudolf spread his arms wide. Look again, lady. This army has already taken Isla. The only holdout is that tiny fort on the lake, and it will not hold out for much longer. A week, she said softly as though it pained her. You think it will take that long? He wanted to say that he could take it in a day, if she needed him to do so. For if this was truly Portia, he would scale the walls alone to save her. Yet here she stood, hardly a prisoner. We only have enough food for a week. I know the state of the castle storerooms and how much we eat. Lena would not have made the same mistake, but I was not prepared for a siege with so many mouths to feed. I do not wish my people to die. I want to sue for peace. Name your terms. Her head darted to the left and right. First, take me to the wolf's tent, where we might discuss this in private. Can you give me that? Of course. She nodded. Do you swear to grant me safe passage into your camp? Into it, but not out. Interesting. I do so solemnly swear. Then take me there, Dolph. He held his hand out once more out of courtesy than any expectation that Portia would need it, until she stumbled. Courtesy be damned. He dived forward to catch her. Release me. It was a command. He set her on her feet on the grass before he did as she asked. She tugged her hood down. Lead the way, Dolph. It took all his willpower not to glance back over his shoulder as he took her to his tent. Nah, he wished he'd accepted the hospitality of one of the nearby crofters, so that he could offer her something better than this. Portia deserved better than this. He straightened the coverlet on his pallet, as though he hadn't been roused from sleep by her arrival. The ancient laws of hospitality demanded that he offer her something to eat and drink, but he had nothing here. His tent was a place to sleep. Nothing more. Rudolf stepped out of his tent and hailed the first man he saw. Bring me a jug of mead, he said. The jug was brought. Too late, Rudolf realized he should have asked for cups to go with it. He re-entered his tent, and there she stood. Her red hair glowed in the firelight of his brazier, haloing her like the saint who had given Loch Findlagan its name. Portia, he breathed. It came out like a prayer to heaven. A prayer that after all he'd endured, this angel might become his. Dolph, she asked uncertainly. I have watched the wolf striding around the camp in that armor all day. This is his tent. Tell me the truth now, for I must know. Who is he? 32. Rudolf set the jug on the ground and bowed. Prince Rudolf Vargson, cousin to Reidar Haraldsson, King of Viken. Reidar's father and mine were brothers. Oh, how she didn't want to believe it. But how could she not believe him? So you are the wolf. The man who has killed, raped and plundered his way across the southern isles to take my home from me. Rudolf shook his head. I swear to you, I am the wolf, but I have done none of those things. I have never raped a woman nor killed one since I set foot on the southern isles. Not even my aunt, who would not have been so kind to me. I have killed men, it is true, though they tried equally hard to kill me. As for plunder, he waved at the unadorned interior of his tent. Do you see anything of worth here? I have taken nothing from the islands that was not given to me freely. The lords of the isles are with me. All but your father, who I'd hoped to find here with you. As for your home, he ducked his head. I may have set fire to it. Just a little, he admitted. But Mason and his men said. Is Mason your husband? Rudolf demanded. Portia had never seen such pain in his eyes. Mason is Donald's man, sent here to secure the islands for Alba. And build high walls to keep people both out and in. Her gaze arrowed in the direction of the castle on Council Island. Is he your husband? Portia laughed bitterly. Mason, who thinks so much of himself? No. He believes I am beneath his notice. The fat pig of a man desires one of Donald's daughters, and he thinks subduing us will earn him that honor. He holds me safe from Viken raiders and other unscrupulous men, who might want to marry me for their own ends. More likely, he thinks to marry me off to whoever Donald sends to replace him. One of Donald's sons, he said. If you are a prisoner, how did you get out? She shook her head. I cannot tell you that. The Dolph I once knew would not ask me to betray my sisters by letting the leader of an enemy army into the chamber where they sleep. If anything, her words had hurt him even more. I have never been and will never be your enemy, Portia. For a long moment, she stared at him. Heaven help her, but she believed him. All the fear and frustration and years of missing him and dreading the future bubbled up. She swallowed back a sob. She couldn't cry now. She had a peace agreement to broker with the wolf, who was not the Dolph she'd known before the war. This man was harder, commanding armies and conquering islands. Conquering her island. What terms will you offer us then, so that my people and yours are not enemies? Portia said. Oh, but it hurt to call the other islanders his people. This man was a foreigner to her, while she'd considered them friends. Once considered him a friend. Rudolf shook his head. That's not how it works. I have given the castellan my terms. I will let everyone in the castle go unharmed, if they lay down their arms and release you. He cannot. Grieve swore an oath to my father, he and all his men, that they would protect me. But he does not have you now. I do. What will he do if you do not return? Triumph glittered in Rudolph's eyes, something else she'd never seen there before. Something died inside Portia. Then Grieve and his men will come in search of me, even if it means attacking the camp. We both know they would die. Grieve is a good man, and so are those who serve under him. Good men, loyal to my father and loyal to me. They don't deserve to die. Not yet. And what do I deserve? I have fought for years for this. For these islands. For your home. She closed her eyes to stop the tears from falling. She should have sent Lena to negotiate on her behalf. Lena's knees would not have weakened at the longing in Rudolph's tone. You can have the islands. All of them. And my home. As long as you promise to spare them too. Rudolf shook his head. They must lay down their arms, yet you say they will not. I once vowed to protect you too, and I would fight as long as I had the breath left to shout a battle cry. If these men are as loyal as you say, they will fight to the death, theirs or ours. Or mine. It came out as a whisper, but Portia couldn't stop it. Never, Rudolf swore. He seized her shoulders. There must be another way, Portia. I let go of you once, and I will not lose you now. Not to Donald or Mason or any man who dares to lay claim to you and your birthright. He dropped to his knees. I will give you everything I've fought for. Every island, every rock, every fishing boat. For you. Her breath caught in her throat. He couldn't mean. What would you ask in return? She asked faintly, pressing her hand to her breast to hide her hammering heart. You. Other men may desire your dowry, but all I've ever wanted is you. He held out his hands in supplication. Marry me, Portia. All her adult life she'd wanted to hear those words, dreading the day she'd have to refuse him. Tonight, she'd come to offer herself to the wolf, knowing it would cut her off from Rudolf forever. But now. If Grieve came in search of me, he could not break a marriage bond, Portia said thoughtfully. My claim would pass to you, my husband. If I stand at your side as your wife, Grieve would open the castle gates to you. She'd said something wrong. The shining love in Rudolph's eyes had gone. Had she imagined it? Rudolf rose. Of course. You think of your men. This Grieve must mean much to you. He sounded bitter. Until my father returns home, they are the last of his men. Just as they swore to protect me, I have a responsibility to them, Portia said. She had little choice, and it lightened her heart enough to see her way clearly for the first time. Yes. Her father would understand. Rudolf had been her heart's choice long ago when she could not have him. As the wolf prince, she could. Hope blossomed. But it must be tonight, before anyone notices I am gone. Or someone will die. He eyed her. A marriage is not valid without vows to be faithful, followed by a consummation. We must do that tonight too. She swallowed. Consummating a marriage was the hardest part. She'd never forget Lena's or Ali's cries of pain on their wedding nights. Dolph might protect her, but he could not save her from himself. It was but a small price to pay to end a war. It shall be as you say. We must wake the priest who serves St. Findlagan's church, and ask him to marry us. 33. I wish you both well. You may use my house for the consummation. I shall return in the morning, Father Fintan said, ducking out the door and into the rain before Rudolf could stop him. Rudolf and Portia stared at each other for a moment. His heart sank at the fear in her expression. He dreamed of this night for half his life, but never had he imagined his first night with her would be in a tiny, cold cottage with a straw pallet so thin and narrow they may as well be making love on the floor like animals. He'd imagined a roaring fire, a room so warm she'd want to take her clothes off, and a big carved bed like the one he'd slept in Viken. We don't have to do this if you do not wish to, Rudolf said. She tossed her head. We do. My father, Mason, and this bloody king of his will dissolve a marriage that hasn't been consummated as quickly as salt in a stew pot. She hoisted her skirts up to her waist. Where would you have me, husband? Husband. The word sounded so good on her lips, and yet, there was no love in the way she said it. Like his firebrand of a wife had died inside by marrying him. Rudolf dismissed the priest's pallet, but that left him little more to choose from. He wanted to hold her close, to kiss her, to make her comfortable when he made love to her for the first time. Rita had made his bride scream for joy on their wedding night. They'd known each other for barely 2 days, and the whole castle had known just how much the queen loved her king. Rudolf had loved Portia for half his life, and he vowed he would show her that tonight. Women enjoyed lovemaking more when they were on top, he'd heard, so Portia must mount him. That mean there, he said, pointing at a bench by the wall. He sat down on the broad seat, and patted his knees. Sit here, my lady. With some difficulty owing to her bundled-up skirts, Portia climbed into his lap. Gently, Rudolf guided her around to face him, so she straddled him. This is not how my sisters did it, she protested. Their husbands made them lie down and... She paled and didn't finish. When we have a bed worthy of you, I shall lay you down upon it, and show you every pleasure a man can give a woman, Rudolf promised. But tonight, it is here or the floor, I'm afraid. He could feel the heat of her now burning through his tunic. With her skirts so high, she was naked to the waist, and he longed to stroke her lovely legs right until he reached the apex where they met, and then... She squirmed in his lap. Why are you so hard? His cock only hardened further in response. He freed it from the folds of his clothes and laid it beside her leg. Because you are so beautiful, he said. She didn't seem to hear him. Her alarmed gaze was fixed on his cock. You're going to stick that huge thing into me? He wanted to laugh, but he feared that wouldn't help. He'd never seen his fearless Portia look so frightened. Actually, the way we're sitting, you'll be in control of that. I'll just position it right, and all you have to do is sink down on it as slowly as you like. Very well. She rose. If she hadn't been wearing her clothes, Rudolf could have kissed her breasts. Next time they made love, he vowed, they'd be naked and he'd kiss them for twice as long to make up for it. Maybe even suck on her nipples a bit too if she liked that. His cock was rock hard now, jutting toward her so eagerly it took all his willpower not to grab her hips and slam her down upon it. They had all night, he reminded himself. All night to take this as slowly as she needed. Portia set her hands on his shoulders and glanced down. It looks even bigger now. Are you sure it will fit? Of course, he soothed, cupping one hand around her bottom to bring her closer. He wrapped his other hand around his shaft, positioning the head of his cock right against her sweet spot. One small push and the irresistible heat of her engulfed the tip. He sucked in a breath, fighting down the urge to thrust hard and deep into her. Now just sink down and I'll slide right in. He closed his eyes, savoring the feel of her. Her nails dug into his shoulders as her molten heat embraced him inch by inch, so tight he wanted to moan in bliss. He had to let her control this. He had to. Because if he did, in 2 or 3 thrusts he'd be done. She felt so incredibly good. He cupped her bottom in both hands now, squeezing her soft flesh to stop himself from pushing her all the way down in one mighty shove. And then, in one delicious eternity, she'd sheathed him completely, clenched down so hard on him that Rudolf feared his cock would blow then and there. He didn't dare move, she felt so exquisite. God, Portia, that feels amazing. She let out a sound that sounded like a sob. Rudolf's eyes flew open. Tears streamed down Portia's cheeks. Please finish this quickly, Dolph. It hurts so. He shifted and she cried out, definitely not in pleasure. Please, she begged. He ripped his cock out of her as if he'd burned it, as well he might have. He tucked himself away, swearing at himself for being such a fool. Portia stumbled back away from him, clutching her skirts to her face as she sobbed into them. A thin trickle of blood ran down her thigh. Maiden's blood, for Portia was a maiden no more. He'd seen to that, and pretty damn clumsily too. Rudolf rose and sat Portia down on his seat. He found a bucket of water and a cloth, cleaning off the blood before she could see it. She cried out as he touched the cloth to her lower lips and Rudolf stopped. He dealt with most of the mess. He dropped the cloth in the bucket and smoothed down Portia's skirts before he took her in his arms. Shush, it's all right. It's over, it's over. Everything's put away, so you just hold on to me and cry as much as you need to. God, she felt good in his arms too. Not quite as good as she did with his cock buried balls deep in her, but nearly. Nearly. Maybe another night, when. Please don't make me do that again, Dolph. It hurts so much. Portia begged. Maybe never. Rudolf sighed. Who'd have thought he'd have such a clumsy cock? So much for giving his bride a blissful wedding night, or any night for that matter. I'll never do anything to hurt you, Portia. I swear it. He swallowed. And there's no need for more. The marriage is consummated. You did it. You and everyone on your island are safe. No one can dissolve our marriage now. He held her as she cried herself out, murmuring endearments aloud even as he silently cursed himself. He had what he wanted, the wife of his dreams and all the Southern Isles. So why did victory feel as cold and miserable as stroking his own cock in the rain? Because that's what he'd be doing as soon as Portia fell asleep, he told himself, so he wouldn't frighten her with the sight of him again. But in the meantime he could hold her close and love her in whatever way she wanted. Because one thing was certain, Rudolf loved his wife, and he'd do anything for her. 34. Portia awoke cold and stiff, like she'd slept on the stone. And with ache between her legs that reminded her. Rudolf. He'd returned and she'd married him last night. She'd known he was too big, but she'd done it anyway. And now he was. Not here. But it couldn't have been a dream. She wouldn't have dreamed such a terrible wedding night. Not with Rudolf. Heaven help her, she'd cried herself to sleep in his arms. No wonder he was gone. Good morning, my lady. Do you wish to break your fast? Portia sat up. The middle-aged priest who'd married them last night stood by the table with his head bowed, as if not daring to look at her. Or perhaps you would like to wash? Memories of Rudolf's hands on her thighs as he cleaned the most intimate parts of her made her blush. What must he think of her? She turned suspicious eyes on the priest. "Do you know who I am?" He smiled. "Of course, Lady Portia. Prince Rudolf was most adamant that I take good care of you until he returns to collect you. He even sent a man with breakfast, so that you might not go hungry. This is more than a poor priest usually sees, unless he is invited to a feast." He waved at the table. "I look forward to the feast when they make him High Lord of the Isles, as is his due." What? Her father was High Lord of the Isles, not Rudolf. Rudolf didn't hold lands here. He was a Viken prince. He probably owned an ice floe somewhere in Viken. I remember the first council meeting Lord Angus brought him to. He was the first man ashore at Lord Angus's behest. I knew it then, but it is even more clear now. Prince Rudolf will rule us well. Rule? Rudolf? She'd married him, but... The priest coughed. "Sorry, my lady. I forget that you are a new bride and perhaps have other things on your mind. Many new brides see their husband differently in the light of day after their wedding night. I often have to remind them that if they lay with their husband often enough, he will never stray, and may soon bless her with strong sons or beautiful daughters. I counsel." "Where is Rudolf now?" Portia interrupted. She had no need for a lecture on her marital duties from a man who knew little about them. "I imagine he is with his army, preparing for battle." "No. I am sure he will return when it is all over. He asked that I keep you safe." "To blazes with safe. There should be no battle. Good men will die if he continues with this stupidity." She smoothed her dress, retying her laces though she did not need to. "Do you possess a comb?" Heaven help her, but she would not turn up at an army camp with straw in her hair. "Of course, my lady. No mirror though, but sometimes I find the collection plate is shiny enough to see myself." He held up the bronze dish, and Portia peered at her reflection. She cursed as she saw the straw in her hair. Combing the mess would be more painful than coupling with Rudolf last night, but she must. She made short work of it, then thanked the priest for his help. "Eat, my lady." The priest pushed the bread toward her. She did not have time, yet she must. Portia seized a piece of bread in one hand and a chunk of cheese in the other. She could eat on the way. The priest helped her fasten her cloak, and she burst outside into the late morning sun. Nearly noon. She broke into a run. 35. Just before noon, the gate opened to let out a boat bigger than the coracle Rudolf had sent across the loch yesterday. With 3 armored men aboard, it was no surprise. 2 red heads watched from the tower window, but he knew neither belonged to Portia. No, she was safe with Father Fintan. He'd ordered his men back from the lake shore, but they still stood to watch. Few wore weapons or armor as he did. This was supposed to be a peace negotiation. Yet the men in the boat looked ready for war. As the 3 stepped ashore, one emerged as a definite leader. The castellan who'd ordered the gates open yesterday, Rudolf guessed. Was this Portia's man Grieve or someone else? Rudolf removed his helm so that he might see them better. The men waited until they reached him before they did the same. "Wolf," the castellan said, with the slightest nod. No, Rudolf did not know this man. "Rudolf," one of his companions said, nudging the 3rd man. "We thought you'd buggered off back to Viken." "Damhen Dermot," Rudolf greeted them after a moment's thought. "As you can see, I have returned." Dermot grinned. "You never were one to run from a fight. I remember the day you arrived. I knocked you down once, but none of the other boys could touch you. You just got up and brushed it off. That's the day you found the 3 little pigs." His glee faded as quickly as it had come. "It seems we need your help again." The castellan hushed him with a glare. "We are not here to ask for help. We are here to negotiate better terms than the ones you offered yesterday." He planted his feet firmly. "We will not hand over Lady Portia." "Won't or can't?" Rudolf wondered. Did they know she was missing? "Did you ask Lady Portia?" he asked. The three exchanged glances. Yes, they did, and yet they'd come to negotiate with him, knowing they had nothing he wanted. That took courage. "What the lady wants is of no consequence. We have sworn an oath to protect her, and we will." Rudolf snorted. He couldn't help it. "Have you even met Portia?" This could not be Grieve. No man she spoke of so highly would try to peddle such nonsense. He toyed with the idea of telling the man he was her husband. Then he'd have his answer, for no man who loved her could hide his pain at hearing that. The Castellan drew his sword. "Have you?" A collective gasp rose from the men behind him. This was no way to conduct a peace negotiation. "Sheath that thing, you bloody fool!" The Castellan's eyes widened and he nearly dropped his sword. "Rona? You lay one finger on this man, Wolf Prince, and our alliance is over," Rona said, striding to the man's side. It seemed the alliance was over already. Rudolf narrowed his eyes. "Who are you?" The Castellan opened his mouth, but it was Rona who answered. "He's Grieve Lewison, my betrothed, and the head of Lady Portia's personal guard." She turned on the man. "Why have the Albans sent you to negotiate?" Damon and Dermot burst out laughing. "What Albans? They've all fled, like the cowards they are. Even Mason, when we shut him out. Council Island and the castle belong to Lady Portia." "No. It belongs to my husband." Portia's voice rang out over the water as she strode along the shore. She wore no shoes and her gown was muddy to the knees, but she walked like a queen. No sign of last night's downpour of tears. Now she was the storm. "Lady Portia. Thank the heavens." Only now did Grieve sheathe his sword. "What happened to you?" "We thought, my lady, your boots." If his men hadn't noticed before, they did now. But that's what he loved about Portia. Thousands of armed men watching, holding their collective breath, and she merely tossed her head and said, "I'm sure my husband will buy me new ones when he is done here." She laid a possessive hand on his arm, lining up beside him against Rona and Grieve. She lifted her burning gaze to Rona, something even Rudolf would have hesitated to do. Should he warn her, he wondered, but there was no time. "Lady Rona," Portia said, offering the woman her cheek. "It is a pleasure. I have heard so much about you." The two women kissed. A little stiffly to be sure, for they were strangers, but the power play between them was palpable. The witch who terrified his men capitulated to Portia. "I look forward to your wedding. You must sit beside me at the feast to celebrate mine," Portia said. She shot a pointed look at Rudolf. "Of course, you and Grieve must sit with us at the high table." "I insist." "My lady," Grieve said weakly, looking from one woman to the other. "I hope you mean Rona, for I'm not yours anymore. Protecting me is Prince Rudolf's job now." Her fingers squeezed his arm. "Isla is ours." Rudolf's men took up the cry until it echoed around the valley. He wanted to weep, but knew he could not. The war was over, and Portia was safe. His to protect. "But what will your father say?" Grieve asked. Portia didn't flinch. "We will find out when he returns home. In the meantime, my husband will take his place in council." And not a man among them dared argue. The Lady of Isla had spoken. 36. She smiled through her wedding feast and said all that needed to be said, but inside Portia felt empty. Rudolf would scarcely look at her, and every time she tried to get his attention, she'd find some lord or other already occupying it. He never even noticed when she bade him good night, and headed up to her tower room, where she slept alone. Her days were as dull as when she'd lived in the loft, for she saw so little of him it was like she had no husband at all. At night he did not come to her room or summon her to his, as was his right. Why, she did not even know where he slept, or if he did. The lords never left him alone, and rumours circled, each wilder than the last. Her men were hers no longer, they'd been pressed into doing things for their lordly fathers. Grieve had been sent to fetch Lord Lewis from Myroy, and there was talk of her father returning. Talk was all it was until she saw the party riding over the ridge. The men on lookout saw him too. Lord Angus. The banners of Islay. Preparations were made to turn the great hall into a council chamber, for there were important matters to be decided. Matters that could only be discussed here on Council Island. Matters that she had no business being part of. So Portia sat alone in her tower, hoping her father might visit her when the meeting was over. There you are. Lord Angus had other ideas, evidently. He'd aged, and he was now missing part of his ear. Why are you not at Rudolf's side in the thick of things, like you used to be? Portia managed a small smile. Every time I see him, he has a lord on each arm and a line of more men waiting to speak to him. He has no time for me. And there is talk of crowning him as King of the Southern Isles, an office we have never had. They wanted to do it right away, but Lord Lewis insisted we had to wait. For you, he said. Angus nodded. I've heard. It's been a long time coming, but it's for the best. Lord Lewis knew I would not want to miss the coronation of our first king. But you're the High Lord of the Isles. I thought he was your friend, why would he want you to answer such an insult in person? Angus laughed. 'Tis not an insult. He is a better man than me, and younger too. I put him forward years ago, before Donald's army came to Islay. Rudolf will make a good king. Do you not think so? He peered at her. You chose the man, so surely you must. He will make an excellent king, Portia said warmly. She'd seen enough over the last few days to know that, if she did not already. But she swallowed. I thought he had feelings for me instead of marrying me for my claim, like the others might have. But Angus laughed so hard he nearly fell off the windowsill. No feelings for you? Rudolf? That man's been in love with you since the day you donned a woman's gown. And I've seen the way you look at him too. Why else do you think you got a personal guard while he was gone? It was not that he has the strength of 10 men, though he is a mighty warrior. Nay, it was because I promised to keep you safe for him until he returned. He would never have left for Viken otherwise. Portia couldn't seem to close my mouth. But he has been so distant since we married. He hasn't. She felt a blush burn her cheeks. He hasn't summoned me to his chambers at all since our wedding night. Ah, he knows you too well is all. Rudolf knows you are not the sort of woman he can order about. You'd punch him in the nose or some more tender place, I'd wager, and he knows it. 'Tis up to you to come to him, I'm sure. It was his turn to blush. Your mother came to me before we were married, and would not take no for an answer. She'd taken some fertility potion a witch had given her, and she wouldn't give herself to any man but me. I think we made you girls that night. He continued, too lost in reflection to realize that Portia had stopped listening. Rudolf wanted her. Maybe even loved her. If her father could see it. Tonight, she said, so softly she didn't think her father heard. Tonight I shall bed the king. 37. Rudolf stepped into the Lord's chambers and slammed the door shut. Why in heaven's name had he agreed to be their king? Congratulations, my king. Portia stepped out of the shadows. The laces across her breasts had come untied, and her gown was in danger of slipping off her shoulders. Rudolf's fingers itched to help, though whether to help her out of her gown or touch her breasts as he retied the laces for her, he wasn't sure. He knew now why he'd accepted the questionable honor of a crown. "I did it for you," he said simply. "As long as the Southern Isles are your home, this is where I shall be." She frowned. "What will the Viking king say?" "We will find out soon enough. His men sail home on the morrow and they will tell him all." He waved away her worries. "I have no doubt Rudolf wants to see me bend the knee with a crown on my head, so that he may laugh at me. But if he sees you, he will understand." Rudolf seized the crown and dropped it on top of a nearby chest. "Now I know how heavy the thing is, I remember why I never wanted one." A tear slipped down Portia's cheek. "I don't understand." Rudolf reached out to wipe it away. He never wanted to see her cry, much less make her do so. "My cousin, King Rudolf, gave me leave to take a force across the sea to free the Southern Isles from Donald and his minions because I begged him to. I came for you, Portia. I took the Isles because they are your birthright and your home, and I will not see anyone take them from you. Everything I have ever done is for you." More tears fell, but this time Portia wiped them away herself. Truly. She took a deep breath. "Then it is only fitting that I should do something for you too. You must have an heir, and though it pains me to do it, I must give you one." Off slid the gown with no help from Rudolf, puddling on the stones at her feet. She stepped out of it like a nymph out of a lake, lifting the hem of her shift. Rudolf's breath caught in his throat as the filmy linen rose over her head before descending to join its fellow on the floor. "God, you're beautiful," he said hoarsely. She towed off her stockings as she made her way to the bed. Naked as the day she was born, Portia spread her body across the covers, the greatest gift any woman ever gave a man. "Please make haste, Dolph. It's cold, and I would prefer to get the painful part over with as quickly as possible." She shuddered, her nipples hardening until Rudolf could look at nothing else. "The pain was hard enough to bear the first time we did this." Rudolf's brow furrowed. "But I thought it only hurt for a girl's first time. After that, there shouldn't be any pain." He'd never asked a girl about it, but he would never forget that first night Rudolf spent with his queen. Her screams hadn't sounded pained. "Are you sure?" "My sisters said their first few nights with their husbands were just as painful. It took them a full week before the act became bearable." Rudolf had no idea, he had no experience with virgins. "You bled that first night. It takes time for a wound to heal, and perhaps that's why it took your sisters a week. It has been a week since I." Portia wet her lips. "Can you check for a wound?" She parted her thighs wider. Rudolf swallowed. He wanted nothing more to be inside her, loving her like Rudolf did his queen. But if it meant hurting her. "Of course I will check." He climbed onto the bed and knelt between her legs. He lifted his gaze to caress the soft skin of her inner thighs, remembering how glorious it had felt to plunge between them. Sliding between those wet lips, gleaming so tantalizingly before him now. Perfect unbroken skin with no wound to be seen. He wanted to reach out and stroke her, but he restrained himself. "You look perfect to me." Portia rose onto her elbows, still frowning. "Did you check inside?" "It wasn't until you were inside me that I started hurting." He lifted her legs over his shoulders, parting her lower lips with his fingers. Silky soft and so wet, his manhood grew rigid, but Rudolf fought to ignore it. Still he could not see anything but perfection. "I can't see inside you," he admitted. "But perhaps I can feel for it." He pushed a finger inside her slowly, stroking her inner walls. She shuddered and clenched around his finger. "Dolph? Did I hurt you?" He repeated the motion, more slowly this time. She gasped. "No. You didn't hurt me. That feels delightful." The more he stroked, the hotter and wetter she became, until she cried out and clenched down hard on his finger as though she would keep it inside her forever. "More," she sighed. More what? Rudolf slid a second finger into her and started stroking harder. Watching her face this time as her breathing grew shallow and her eyes closed, he sent her to her climax faster this time. God, what he would give to join her in reaching such a pleasurable peak together, he thought as she arched her back up off the bed and cried his name. More than anything, he wanted to put more than his fingers inside her. It would be different this time, he promised himself as he shucked off his clothes. At the slightest sign that he was hurting her, he'd stop, but he needed to be inside her. Now. He lifted his manhood, poised to thrust deep into her. What are you doing? She asked, fear darkening her eyes. God help him, he couldn't hurt her again. It would kill him to see her cry and know he'd caused it. Rudolf rolled onto his back so he lay on the bed beside her. He ached to impale her. Soon, he promised himself. Just like the night we were wed, he said breathlessly. You sit on top of me so you can control how deep I go. There is no wound I can feel, inside or out. I won't hurt you, Portia, and this will feel better than my fingers, I promise. He prayed that this last part wouldn't be a lie. He'd never forgive himself. If you are sure. Portia rose up onto her knees and shuffled until she straddled him, one leg on either side of his. I'm afraid, she admitted. Don't be, he said, grabbing his cock in one hand as he rested his other hand on her hip. Gently, he guided the tip of his cock inside her, holding firmly to her hip when she reflexively flinched away. Now move down, Portia. She bit her lip, nodded once, then lowered herself onto him. Inch by inch, he glided into her molten core. God, this woman was heaven. This time he kept his eyes firmly on her face, alert for any sign of pain. He would not hurt her again while he was lost in his own pleasure. Her mouth dropped open and her eyes widened, but still she descended, engulfing him so completely that her well-rounded backside rested against his balls. It doesn't hurt, she breathed. With agonizing slowness, she rose up and then down his length again. That feels good. She raised herself again. If he left this all up to Portia, her next climax would take all night, so Rudolf took control. He fastened both hands around her hips and met her downward slide with a hard thrust. She gasped surprised, but then she smiled. Again. With Rudolf's help, she soon rode him in a rocking rhythm that felt every bit as good as he'd imagined it would. And when he felt her clenching around him in her third climax, Rudolf shouted her name as he found his own release. I love you, Portia, he gasped out, staring up at her. Her breasts heaved as she fought to catch her breath, huffing and puffing as though she intended to blow the very castle down around them, but her brilliant smile was telling enough until she managed to say, I love you too, Dolph. Can we do that again? Every night, Rudolf promised. A good husband keeps his wife happy, and I intend to see you happy ever after. She smiled mischievously. The tomorrow you shall take me for a ride, just the two of us, and when we reach a good place to stop, we shall make love all over again. He stroked her leg, feeling his spirits rising once more. Portia was the only woman for him, now and forever. Who said we must wait until tomorrow? Her eyes widened with alarm before her expression softened to surprise, and she did some stroking of her own. Don't make me wait, Dolph. Never again, he vowed, and when they came together again it seemed the very air sang for joy. This has been Blow. 3 Little Pigs Retold. A Tale in the Romance, a Medieval Fairytale series. Written by Demelza Carlton. Autonarrated by AI Charlotte from Google.